Missouri, August 1st, 1828. A wooden cabin smolders under the cloak of night, its walls succumbing to the devouring flames. The cries of children, once piercing and desperate, have fallen into a haunting silence. 5 lives extinguished, 3 belonging to her master, 2 belonging to her own blood. Neighbors whisper of cruelty, of a crime too dark to name aloud. Yet for Anise, an enslaved woman stripped of any hope for her children, this act was born not of malice but of despair, an act carved from the raw, jagged edges of suffering. As dawn spilled its pale light over the rolling fields of Missouri, she stepped into history, not as a victim, nor as a heroine, but as a living, breathing testament to a haunting truth. Even a mother's love can be twisted, broken, and reshaped by the unrelenting chains of slavery. Anise's story does not begin with choice. It begins with captivity. She entered the world already bound by invisible cords, tethered to a system that determined her worth before she could even walk, before she could even speak. The precise year and place of her birth remain uncertain, as the records of enslaved women were rarely preserved, and when they were often stripped of identity, reduced to ledger entries and bare numbers. Yet even in this absence, we can sense the heavy silence that marked her very first breath. She was born in Missouri, a frontier state torn between untamed wilderness and the slow encroachments of settlement, where cotton and cornfields stretched endlessly, cultivated by hands that could never, claim the fruits of their labor. From the moment of her birth, Anise's life was shaped by others, dictated by those who saw her as property, as labor, as a vessel, rather than a person. She was taught to toil before she learned to speak. Her earliest lullabies were not gentle songs, but the sharp cracks of whips and the sighs of women bent over the fields, their voices lifted in hymns, half in prayer, half in mourning. Her cradle may have been a rough-hewn wooden box set near the hearth of the cabin, yet its shadow stretched far beyond, into the laboring fields of her future. A child in bondage inherited no family name that carried weight, no land, no tangible legacy, only the relentless certainty of toil. And the cruelest truth of all was this: even her own body did not belong to her. Enslaved women knew from the beginning that their wombs were never truly their own. To give birth was not to extend one's family, but to increase another's property. This bitter reality shaped Anise's girlhood like a gathering storm on the horizon. Even as a child, she learned that laughter could summon punishment, that innocence offered no shield. She grew up in the cramped quarters where stories were whispered in the dark, stories of Africa, of stolen ancestors, of resistance and despair. Those hushed voices, carrying memory and longing, became the only inheritance she would ever receive beyond the chains that bound her. Among those stories, one lesson echoed louder than the rest. The cycle repeats. The daughter of a slave becomes the mother of slaves, and each new life enters the world already sold in spirit, if not yet in flesh. Anise would one day become a mother herself. But the seeds of fear, of inevitable grief, were sown early. To be born into chains meant never truly being born free at all. It meant stepping into a life dictated by men who never recognized her humanity, who never imagined she could dream for herself. Her childhood was not measured in toys or lessons, but in survival. Every bruise, every backbreaking day in the field, every whispered warning imparted the same lesson: your life is not yours to shape. When she glimpsed newborns swaddled beside baskets of cotton, she must have understood, even as a young girl, that the cradle was only the first link in a chain, soft beginnings laid upon hard earth, lives that from their very first breath belonged more to the master's ledger than to the arms that birthed them. When Anise herself became a mother, the joy of holding a child came wrapped in terror. She cradled her infant, yet even in that fleeting warmth lingered a bitter truth. Her child was not hers. By law, by custom, by the unforgiving arithmetic of slavery, her baby belonged to the master. Every heartbeat, every fragile breath, was shadowed by the unalterable knowledge that the future had already been purchased, written on the same ledger that claimed her life, her body, her children. In the quarters, the older women whispered truths that carried the weight of generations. They told Anise what to expect: children taken from their mothers, traded like horses at a market, or forced into labor before their bones had hardened enough to bear the burden. Some spoke of mothers beaten for clinging too tightly to their infants, for daring to believe they had any claim over their own flesh. Each story fell on Anise's ears like a stone sinking into water, and with every tale, her heart grew heavier, laden with a grief she had not yet fully lived. Motherhood in the world of bondage was no blessing. It was a wound that never truly healed. By night, she nursed her infant with gentle hands, knowing that by the light of day, her child might be torn from her arms. She rocked the tiny body with songs trembling between love and sorrow, soft hymns meant to soothe, yet simultaneously preparing both mother and child for the inevitability of separation. Every cry from her baby was a double-edged sword. Fierce love mingled with unbearable dread. The wail of an infant, a sound meant to promise life, became to Anise a prophecy, a voice already marked by chains and loss. She imagined her child growing into the same fields, facing the same punishments, enduring the same endless cycle of oppression. And in that imagination, she saw her own reflection, trapped, exhausted, voiceless, and tethered to a system that refused to recognize her humanity. Love made her fierce, but fear made her desperate. For Anise, motherhood was like tending a fragile plant in poisoned soil. You water it, nurture it, watch it stretch toward the light, yet you know the ground beneath is salted, that the growth you hope for will never reach its fullness. Her children were saplings rooted in earth that would not let them stand tall. The other women knew this too. They carried their infants through the heat of the fields, setting them down between rows of cotton, only to watch overseers calculate their babies as future profit. The very act of giving life was twisted into economic gain for another. Anise's fear was quiet but relentless. It crept into every corner of her days, into the meals she prepared, the songs she sang, the nights she rocked her children to sleep. It whispered of inevitability, gnawing at her soul. Yet despite it all, she loved them fiercely, with all the consuming power of a mother's heart. That paradox, loving what she could not protect, nurturing what would one day be enslaved, gnawed at her, shaping the impossible decision that loomed in her future. The master's house was built not merely from timber and stone, but from the lives of those who sustained it. Every time Anise stepped through its doors, carrying trays, sweeping ashes, or bowing to his orders, she knew this truth. To her, the mansion was less a home and more a living ledger, a monument to arithmetic, where human beings were measured not by their worth, but by numbers. Her master did not speak of her children as children. He spoke of them as increase. Each birth in the quarters was not celebrated with joy, but recorded in calculation, as though another calf had been added to a herd. Anise's womb became a site of profit. When she bore children, her master's fortune grew. When those children reached working age, his labor force multiplied. No chains were required in such a system. The true fetters were economic logic and merciless calculation. Overseers noted births in ledgers alongside bales of cotton and barrels of corn. A child's first cry was nothing more than an entry, neat and precise in ink that disregarded blood, tears, and maternal grief. She noticed how her master's gaze lingered not on her, but on her children, as if her own existence mattered only as a vessel, a means of production. She had value not for her humanity, but for her capacity to reproduce. In that cold, crushing realization, her motherhood was not sacred. It was twisted, corrupted, and turned into a commodity. Her motherhood was twisted into something unrecognizable. When she walked past the nursery reserved for the master's children, she saw cradles lined with silk, soft blankets, and plush pillows. Her own child's cradle, by stark contrast, was nothing more than a basket of rags placed on a dirt floor. Yet in her master's eyes, the difference between those children was not merely comfort. It was destiny itself. His children were heirs to a name, a fortune, a future. Hers were commodities, counted in ledgers, valued in profit margins, and destined for the same relentless labor she had known since birth. The cruelest truths revealed themselves in the smallest moments. When Anise's baby laughed, her chest expanded with joy, a fragile flame of maternal love. But if the master happened to overhear, his cold, detached assessment cut through that warmth. Not on the joy of life, he seemed to calculate, but on the strength of lungs, the promise of future labor. Her child's humanity was invisible, only utility mattered. This, Anise learned, was the silent violence of slavery. No whips, no visible scars, only the subtle, soul-crushing erasure of human identity, the reduction of vibrant life into mere inventory. The master's house stood as a shrine to that brutal arithmetic, its walls lined with ledgers more binding than any chain. Anise had walked away from that house countless times, yet it lingered inside her, etched into her mind and heart. Each visit reminded her of the inescapable truth: her children were not hers. They were entries in someone else's fortune, pawns in someone else's legacy. Every step across the polished wooden floors deepened that fear. Each creak of a board, each tally inked into the ledger, whispered the same cold, unyielding message: your children are not your own. The quarters, by day, were sites of ceaseless labor. By night, they became havens for whispers, secrets shared under the cloak of darkness. When the fields finally fell silent, and the overseer's boots receded into the night, the enslaved gathered around dim fires. Here, truths too dangerous to speak by daylight were passed on in murmurs. Anise listened intently. She heard women recount tales of infants sold off before they were 5, torn from arms that could never hold them long enough. She heard men whisper of failed escapes, of whippings and brands that etched cruelty into flesh. She heard despair woven into lullabies, sung low so that children might sleep without hearing the horrors hidden beneath the melody. In these quarters, survival was inseparable from silence. But silence was never empty. It was alive with questions, prayers, and murmurs of rebellion. Someone at some time dared to speak what everyone feared: there is no future for our children. The words lingered like smoke, dense, suffocating, and unrelenting. For Anise, those whispers became unbearable echoes. She had lived their truth in her own arms. Every time her child stirred in sleep, she saw invisible chains tightening around ankles not yet grown. Every laugh from her baby was a fleeting moment, already shadowed by exhaustion and grief. Fear, persistent and gnawing, gradually hardened into thought. Thought, whispered over nights and months, grew into something darker: resolve. She wondered, in the quiet recesses of her mind, if freedom could not be given, if the cycle of bondage could not be broken, was death a crueler fate than life in chains? Could ending suffering before it began in some perverse, twisted way be an act of mercy? The whispers carried these questions, though none dared voice them aloud. Some prayed for heaven as the only true escape. Some whispered hopes that death would come gently, should it arrive too soon. Others admitted in the softest tones that they had sometimes wished their babies might not survive. Spared, they thought, from the life that awaited them. Anise absorbed these murmurs like dry embers catching fire. They smoldered inside her, waiting for wind to ignite them. She was not alone in her despair, yet she felt uniquely bound to act. Her love for her children was fierce, consuming, and yet her fear for them was deeper still. The quarters had taught her that silence could carry entire revolutions of thought, but it had also taught her that shared despair could crystallize into clarity. In the stillness of those nights, Anise's heart and mind began to weave a vision of impossible choice, a path no mother should ever be forced to walk. Anise's heart had become a battlefield. Love and fear clashed endlessly within her, each struggle etching itself into her soul until the outlines of an impossible decision began to take shape. She had not yet acted, yet in the whispering darkness, the seed of her fate had been firmly planted. The night of August 22nd, 1828, arrived without omen. The Missouri summer air hung heavy and thick, carrying the faint, distant scent of wood smoke from hearths across the countryside. Yet in one small cabin, Anise's breath came shallow, her mind circling the thought that had haunted her for months, that had grown with every sleepless night, every whispered warning, every observation of the cruel arithmetic of slavery. Fear had been her constant companion, a second heartbeat pulsing in her chest. But tonight, fear shifted, sharpened into action. Accounts would later call it murder. But in Anise's eyes, it was something else entirely, an attempt to end a cycle that had devoured generation after generation. She could not buy freedom for her children. She could not bargain with the cold calculations of the master's ledgers. What remained for her in the harshest calculus of her world was the most terrible form of mercy. She waited until the quarters lay heavy with silence. The night insects hummed in a steady rhythm, their chorus the backdrop to her resolve. Shadows stretched long across the walls of the cabin, stretching into the corners where her children slept. their tiny breaths rising and falling in fragile harmony. In another part of the house, the master's own children dozed, wrapped in comfort and oblivion, unaware that the future was being reshaped around them. No whip cracked. No overseer shouted. There was only Anise, trembling, yes, but unbroken. She moved with a strange, terrible grace, as if carrying both death and deliverance in her hands. What she did cannot be described in detail. The violence belongs to a register too raw to name. What matters is the silence that followed, the sudden cessation of cries, the thickening air, the fire that began to devour both wood and memory. Neighbors later claimed the flames reached high enough to illuminate the fields, the timbers collapsing like the skeletons of some great beast, sparks leaping skyward like condemned souls. But none saw Anise standing within that inferno, clutching herself as though trying to hold together a heart splitting in two. The act was sudden, yet its roots stretched far back into the past, into every cradle set beside rows of cotton, every ledger line counting children as property, every whispered fear in the quarters. The fire was not merely the burning of a cabin. It was the eruption of generations of despair. When the roof caved in and the cries finally ended, Anise's figure remained frozen in the glow, a solitary silhouette against the inferno. In that moment, she was neither villain nor martyr, but something far more complex. A mother whose love had collided with a world so cruel that death appeared as rescue. The fire would fade, the ashes would cool, but the silence it left behind would echo longer than any scream. Dawn crept softly across Missouri, gilding the fields with pale light, yet it could not disguise the devastation. Where a cabin had once stood, only blackened timber remained, smoke curling skyward like the ghost of the night's grim deeds. By sunrise, news had spread. Neighbors gathered, eyes wide, hands over mouths. The story traveling from house to house, from white settlers to enslaved quarters alike. 5 children were gone, 3 of the master's, 2 of Anise's own. In a society obsessed with order, this act was chaos incarnate. To the white community, it was monstrous. They called her heartless, a creature without maternal instinct, proof that slavery was necessary to control such dangerous souls. Her name became a cautionary tale, reduced in their retellings to nothing but savagery. Yet in the quarters, the whispers carried a different tone. Some shook their heads in sorrow, some in silent understanding. Some saw in her a reflection of the impossible choices forced upon mothers in bondage, a grim testament to the cruel arithmetic of a world that counted human beings in profit and loss, rather than love and life. In the quarters, grief hung heavy, almost palpable, as people struggled to fathom the cost of what had occurred. Yet among hushed whispers, some spoke of her with a reverence too quiet to name aloud. She freed them, one murmured. She spared them what we could not. For those who understood the desperation of a mother with no path to protect her children, Anise's act was not madness, but a terrible, wrenching form of mercy. Children peered through smoke-stained air, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and awe. They could not fully comprehend what had happened, but they sensed its weight, a shadow falling over their small lives. The story traveled quickly, older children carrying it forward, whispered around the evening fires, becoming both a warning and a lament intertwined, a tale that would linger long after the flames faded. The master's family, enraged and humiliated, demanded swift retribution. What had been taken from them was not only children, but pride, control, the illusion of untouchable power. Justice, as they defined it, would brook no delay, no questioning of the circumstances, no consideration of the agony that had produced such an act. For Anise herself, little is recorded of those hours. We do not know if she wept, if she prayed, if she stood in silence as the ashes cooled and the smoke dissipated. History does not preserve her voice, only the judgments leveled upon her. Yet one can imagine her sitting apart, eyes hollow, body trembling with both grief and grim certainty. The cycle had ended for her children, even if only through fire. By mid-morning, the event had transformed from tragedy into rupture. To some, it was a crime too great to forgive. To others, it was the desperate final act of a mother against a system that had left her no other choice. The sun rose, casting pale light across Missouri's fields, but nothing would ever look the same. Smoke lingered in the air, marking the land and the people who had borne witness. a silent testament to the impossible circumstances that birthed such devastation. The law came swiftly. Within days, Anise was seized, shackled, and brought before a court. There was no careful investigation, no weighing of evidence, no acknowledgement of her humanity. In Missouri, in 1828, the justice system existed not for the enslaved, but to reinforce their bondage. The courthouse was crowded, not with advocates or sympathetic ears, but with neighbors hungry for spectacle. Anise entered in chains, her body stooped, her face hollow, every step weighed down by a life of oppression. She was not allowed to speak for herself. No lawyer defended her. Her story, her fear, her anguish as a mother, all of it was excluded from the record. The trial moved swiftly, a formality concluded before it began. Witnesses recounted the blaze, the cries, the blackened ruin of the cabin. The master's family demanded vengeance, their words laced with rage and grief. To them, Anise was less a woman than a cautionary tale, proof that an enslaved person, left unchecked, could commit unspeakable acts. The judge listened not to assess truth or context, but to affirm the sentence already written by society's cruel logic. When Anise stood before him, she was not a defendant. She was property accused of destroying property. Even in death, her children were reduced to the status of lost assets. The master's ledger, that cold arbiter of human value, dictated the language of justice once more. Perhaps Anise whispered something, words of grief, of explanation, or of despair. But if she did, history did not record it. Silence became her companion, as it had so often in life. The jury, all white and drawn from the very community demanding vengeance, deliberated briefly. Their verdict was unanimous, guilty. The sentence, predetermined, was death by hanging. When the gallows were readied, it was not merely Anise who was condemned. It was her humanity, her motherhood, her very existence under a system that saw women like her as nothing more than vessels of labor and reproduction. In the eyes of the court, any possibility of understanding was erased in favor of punishment. They refused to see her as a mother driven to despair. They refused to ask what it meant for slavery to twist maternal love into something so unbearable, so incomprehensible. The trial lasted only hours, but the outcome had been decided long before the first witness spoke. By the end of that day, Anise was no longer Anise to Missouri. She was a cautionary tale, a criminal slave. Her humanity buried beneath the cold, immovable word guilty, yet in the faces of those who watched from the shadows, the enslaved, who dared gather at the edges, there lingered another verdict, unspoken, but alive. Anise had done what no law could explain. She had defied a system that permitted no defiance, asserting, in the only way she could, a form of agency over a life that had been stolen before birth. The morning of August 23, 1828, dawned with a chill unusual for late summer. Anise was led from her cell, shackles clinking in the still air. The gallows had already been prepared, standing tall against the sky like a grim monument, a silent witness to both authority and terror. Crowds gathered, drawn as much by curiosity as by the promise of vengeance. Men brought sons to witness the warning, women whispered behind gloved hands. To them it was a public spectacle, a lesson carved into flesh and rope. Anise's steps were slow but deliberate. She wore no fine garments, only the plain worn clothes of a woman who had labored and suffered her entire life. Her eyes, some remarked, did not dart in fear, but remained fixed on the horizon, as if she were looking past the crowd, past the noose, towards something that no one else could see. The sheriff read the sentence aloud. Words like murder and crime rang across the hushed assembly, yet they fell hollow to those in the quarters who had come to watch from a distance. To them, Anise was not a monster, but a mother forced to choose an impossible path. When the rope was placed around her neck, silence deepened. History itself seemed to hold its breath. For the white community, justice had been served. For the enslaved, it was a morning too dangerous to display openly. Heads were bowed, voices lowered, names whispered into the wind. Anise. Anise, a fragile prayer carried like smoke across the fields. There are no records of her final words, if she spoke them at all. Perhaps she prayed. Perhaps she cursed. Perhaps she said nothing, holding her grief and resolve close, keeping both alive until the very end. What is certain is that her death was swift. Her body left to hang as a warning. Children in the crowd looked on, some too young to understand, some old enough to carry the image into their dreams. Anise's figure on the gallows became more than punishment. It became a message etched into collective memory. For the masters, it reaffirmed control. For the enslaved, it carved a wound into the soul, yet also created a memory they could not erase. In whispered voices passed from one generation to the next, August 23rd became more than the date of Anise's death. It became the moment her story began to live. In the hot Missouri air that morning, Anise was both silenced and remembered, erased in the official records yet alive in the murmurs of those who refused to forget. When the gallows were taken down and the crowd dispersed, Missouri moved on. For the authorities, the case was closed, neatly tied in a knot of punishment. Anise's name appeared in the records in only a few dry lines. Anise, executed for the murder of 5 children. That was all. No mention of fear, no mention of desperation, no mention of the cruel weight of slavery pressing on a mother's heart. The official documents flattened her life into a crime. What she endured, what she carried, what she lost, none of that would be recorded. Yet it remained alive in memory, whispered along the margins, carried in silence, and preserved in the unyielding witness of those who saw more than what the law would acknowledge. Anise's story, though erased from ledgers, lived on in the hearts of the people who dared to remember. Yet for the world of white lawmakers, Anise had no story worth preserving. This was the second death of Anise, the eraser. In the years that followed, her name slipped further from memory, repeated only in cautious whispers among those who had known her in the quarters. The master's family ensured the narrative remained fixed. She was a savage. She was cruel. She had killed her own. Their words were designed to bury her humanity forever. In many ways, they succeeded. Anise's life faded into obscurity, locked away in county records that few would ever read. She became less than a person, more a rumor, a cautionary tale reshaped to serve the system that had destroyed her. Yet, erasure is never perfect. History has cracks, and in those cracks whispers survive. Enslaved mothers carried her memory quietly, passing it to their daughters like a warning. Do not forget what this world can do to us. Do not forget how desperation can break even the strongest heart. Her name appears only rarely in archives, but each time it does, it is like the faintest breath of a ghost. To the historian's eye, she may be a footnote. To those who survived her world, she was far more than that. She was the embodiment of the silence they carried, the fear they knew, the love they risked. Erasure could strip away her voice, but it could not erase the questions she left behind. Why must a mother see death as the only gift she can offer her children? What kind of system could force such a choice? These questions linger heavier than the rope that ended her life. Heavier than any ledger or law, Anise lives on, not in statues or honored names, but in the haunting gaps of the record, in the uncomfortable truth that history tried to bury. She remains, waiting for remembrance. Anise died on a summer morning in 1828, but her story has not ended. It reaches across time, asking us to see her not merely as a criminal, but as a mother who faced an impossible choice. History may call it murder, but in her silence we hear something else. A testimony against a system so cruel it could twist the most sacred bond into despair. Her verdict remains in our hands. Will we remember her as a monster, or as proof of how slavery broke even the strongest heart? Some names nearly erased still deserve to be remembered. Some stories, like Anise's, demand that we listen.